Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's presentation. So, as I mentioned in the previous voice note, I'm going to be looking at the asylum process, who is a refugee, who is an asylum seeker, and what steps there are in the process. You can see above there's a infographic a link to a series of infographics. The one infographic above sets out the steps in terms of applying for asylum. And then the infographic below that gives an overview of the entire asylum process. When we talk about who is a refugee is a person who fits within one of three definitions. It's somebody who has a well-founded fear of persecution based on their political opinion, their race, their religion, their membership of a particular social group, and they're unable or unwilling to seek protection from their government. So, for example, if somebody was being targeted because of their political opinion or they suffered from persecution as a result of their religion, then that would be somebody who has a well-founded fear of persecution, and they may be able to claim asylum, refugee status in terms of Section 3A of the Refugees Act. In order to claim asylum, you don't necessarily need to have an actual political opinion or religion or ethnicity. It can also be something that is attributed to you, that is placed upon you. So, for example, you might not support any political party, but you might be seen as somebody or perceived as somebody who is in opposition to the ruling party in your country, and because of that you may be targeted. So it's not only a well-founded fear of persecution based on something that you have, it might also be something that is actually not true about you, but that is imputed to you, that is something that you are perceived to have or possess. The second definition in terms of who is a refugee is somebody who fled from generalized violence or war. So they speak to events, foreign occupation, domination, or events seriously disturbing or disrupting to public order. So when we talk about events seriously disturbing or disrupting to public order, we're talking about a violent or war-torn situation. The third definition of a refugee is covered by Section 3C of the Refugees Act, and that's somebody who is dependent on somebody who falls within one of the first two definitions. So if you are the child of somebody who has a well-founded fear of persecution in terms of Section 3A of the Refugees Act, or if you are the child and dependent of somebody who falls within Section 3B, so events seriously disturbing and disrupting to public order, then you would be able to get refugee status as the dependent of that person in terms of Section 3C of the Refugees Act. So now we know who is a refugee, somebody who has a well-founded fear of persecution, somebody who fled events seriously disturbing and disrupting to public order, or somebody who's dependent on them. One now needs to understand how the asylum process works and what steps there are in the process. And that brings me to that diagram that you can see that was posted at 8:26, entitled The Asylum System in South Africa. It's available also in French and English, as well as some other languages on our webpage. The link was shared above. In terms of the process diagram, a person first applies for asylum. They would usually send off an email, and then once they get an appointment date, they make an application for asylum. They complete a form at Home Affairs, which sets out their name, their parents, their children, and asks a little bit about your country of origin, the country that you are from. Once you have completed that form, then you go for an interview with a Refugee Status Determination Officer, an RSDO, who considers your refugee or asylum claim and must decide whether or not you meet or fall under one of those three definitions that I've discussed above. If you're considered to be somebody who has a well-founded fear of persecution, or somebody who is dependent on somebody like that, or somebody who fled from events seriously disturbing to disrupting the public order, like somebody who fled from a war-torn situation, like Gail, then you would be granted refugee status. If the decision maker at Home Affairs does not feel that you meet all of the requirements for the definition, or believes that your explanation of your account, your l'histoire, your reasons for which you left your country and reasons for which you can't return, they don't think that you meet all the requirements, then your case will be rejected in all likelihood as unfounded. If the decision maker believes that you don't meet even some of the requirements, you don't meet any of the requirements whatsoever, and don't meet any of the elements of the definition, then your case would be rejected as manifestly unfounded. So those are the three options. You're granted refugee status, your case is rejected as unfounded, or rejected as manifestly unfounded. If you are granted refugee status, you'll be issued a refugee status certificate or refugee status document that is valid for a period of 4 years. If you have that refugee status document for 4 years, and then a further 4 years, and then a further 2 years, so you meet 10 years on refugee status, and you can prove that it's still not safe to return to your country, then you may apply to the Standing Committee for Refugee Affairs for certification towards permanent residence. We would strongly recommend that if that's a route that you want to take, you should maybe look to a legal advisor, because there are a lot of people who seek to apply for permanent residence through this route, and they find that the government doesn't believe that they're still at risk in going back to their country, and then they face possible withdrawal of their refugee status document. If your case is rejected as unfounded, then you are issued with a form called a notice of appeal, which is a initial page that says you want to appeal, you want a second chance to explain your case to Home Affairs, and attached to that is an affidavit, which is a déclaration. It's a sworn declaration that you set out the reasons why you left your country, the reasons why you can't go back, and the reasons why you feel you fall within the definition of a refugee. After you complete the affidavit, then you will appear, you'll go for a case before a quasi-judicial body, a judge who will listen to your case at the Refugee Appeal Authority. The Refugee Appeal Authority will listen to your case, and they will either decide that you're a refugee, or they will decide that your case must go back to the person who decided the first case, or they will confirm the rejection and then they will require you to leave the country. If your case is rejected as manifestly unfounded, then you don't automatically go before a judge of the Refugee Appeal Authority for your case, but instead your case automatically goes to the Standing Committee for Refugee Affairs. It is advisable, if your case is rejected as manifestly unfounded and you do have a refugee claim, that you write a letter, you write written representations to explain why you think you're a refugee. And then the Standing Committee can decide whether or not to confirm the rejection decision and tell you that you've been finally rejected and you should leave the country, or to send the decision that you were rejected back to the original decision maker, to the Refugee Status Determination Officer, or they can grant you refugee status. And that, in a nutshell, is the refugee status determination process. That's the asylum system. Let's begin at the first step in the process. Since the pandemic, since COVID-19, we have begun to apply for asylum online via email. So you will need to send an email to the Department of Home Affairs to apply for asylum. If you do not yet have an email address, the first thing you need to do is you need to set up an email address, and you must choose which refugee office in the country you want to apply for asylum to. So you could apply for asylum to the Durban Refugee Reception Office, to the Desmond Tutu Refugee Reception Office in Pretoria, to the Gqeberha Refugee Reception Office in Port Elizabeth, or to the Messina Refugee Reception Office. Once you've decided which office you're going to apply to and you've set up an email address if you don't already have one, then you must send off an email to Home Affairs by completing a form, adding attachments, if any, and then waiting for a response, which will give you a date on which you must go for an appointment, and then you go for your appointment to begin the asylum and refugee process in that diagram that I explained. At the moment, when we look at applying to a refugee reception office, there are certain email addresses for each refugee reception office. At the moment, the Gqeberha Refugee Reception Office, formerly known as the Port Elizabeth Refugee Reception Office, doesn't have any appointments for 2023. So when we're advising people to apply for asylum, it is potentially not so advisable to apply to that office. One may apply, therefore, to the Durban office, to the Pretoria office, or if one can afford to travel that far, applying to the Messina Refugee Reception Office. The infographic on how to apply for asylum sets out in step 3 the format that the email must take when you're applying for asylum. It's very important that in the subject line of the email, like the title of the subject line of the email, you write the name of the refugee office that you want to apply to. So in the example we give on our infographic, it says you under subject Durban Refugee Reception Office. In the body of the email, you would write something like, Dear Sir or Madam, I would like to apply for asylum in South Africa. Here's my full name. Here is my cell phone number. There is a form that will be sent to you from Home Affairs, which you must fill out. You print the form and you can fill it out, and then you can take a photograph and attach it, or scan and attach it. The information that you include on the form must be true and correct. The form must be done in clear handwriting, or if you know how to, you can also type it onto the form. You must list all your family members, your wife or husband, your parents, your children, anybody that is with you here in South Africa. You can attach a number of documents, and we would recommend that among the documents you attach is perhaps a birth certificate or an ID document, marriage certificate. It's not required that you attach a passport, but it is recommended that you do attach if you do have those other supporting documents. You may then attach the form as well as the completed form as well as any supporting documents, and send off the email with those documents attached to the email addresses listed in the infographic, and I'll go through each of those. It is important to note that, as I mentioned before, you put in the subject line of the application the refugee reception office where you're making an application to. The email address that you must make the application to is newasylum2022@dha.gov.za. That's newasylum2022@dha.gov.za. After completing the form and preparing the email and attaching the documents and sending it off, then one needs to wait for an appointment. In some instances, you get an acknowledgement of receipt email first, and then after that, you will get an email giving you an appointment. Because it's sometimes a number of weeks or months before you had issued an appointment to a refugee reception office, we recommend that once you've sent off the email, with the attachments that you actually print out the form and the email itself that you sent off, and you walk around with that so that you have some evidence or proof that you may provide to anybody who wants to ask or find out whether or not you've tried to apply for asylum. It's very important in cases where people are maybe being stopped by the authorities. It's important to have that to reduce the risk of being arrested or stopped by authorities. When you go to apply for asylum, then you will follow the process as I indicated on the diagram, beginning with completing a form. In practice, Home Affairs has added an additional step where you first will need to have your fingerprints taken when you first go to apply for asylum so that they can check that you perhaps haven't applied for asylum or another visa before. And once they've cleared your fingerprints, then you begin by completing the form, and you go through the process, completing the form, going for the interview with a refugee status determination officer, and then they make a determination as to whether or not you are a refugee. It's important to note that when you go for an interview to the refugee status determination officer, and then they give you a decision, once you've received that decision, then on that decision, there will be a Home Affairs reference number. For example, if it's from Messina, then it will start MUS, and then it'll have 3 letters for your country, perhaps COD, and then it'll have a number of numbers, 0054 0422. Whatever Home Affairs reference number, that will become your official asylum or refugee reference or identification number, and it's that number that you'll need to use to make an application via email for an extension of your asylum or refugee document, and it's also that number you'll need to use to apply for your very first asylum document after you receive a decision from Home Affairs. And that you can do by following the process on how to extend your asylum document, which is another infographic. The infographic is available on the link that I gave above, and I've just shown the first page of the diagram below there. Again, the process is similar to applying via email to make your first application for asylum. You first, if you haven't already got an email address, you would need to set up an email address. Once you set up an email address, then you will complete the form and apply for an extension of your asylum document, or you apply for your first asylum document if you have received a decision from a refugee status determination officer. When you apply to extend your asylum or refugee document, you will need to complete the form. You will need to email to the appropriate or correct refugee reception office, and you will need to attach proof of residence. Proof of residence can be in the form of a bill or in the form of any document that is sent to your address with your name on it and the address where you are staying. Or alternatively, it can be in the form of an affidavit obtained from the police station. If you have lost your asylum or your refugee document and therefore are not able to attach it, then you can attach an affidavit explaining the circumstances of losing and how you lost your document. If you do have a copy of your asylum or refugee document, then you must also attach that along with your proof of residence. If you are applying to get your first document, then you would attach the first page of the decision from Home Affairs, as well as your proof of residence. And then you would email off to the correct and appropriate email address. There are a number of different email addresses that you must email to, depending on where you last went to go and extend your asylum or refugee document. For example, if the last office that you went to was the Quebec, or formerly known as the Port Elizabeth Refugee Reception Office, then if it's an asylum document, you would write an email to perrc.extension22@dha.gov.za. If you are extending your refugee status and the last extension of your refugee status was at that same office, then it would be perrc.extension24@dha.gov.za. So the extension 24 is where it's dealing with a refugee status document. The extension 22 address would be in terms of an asylum seeker document. And those are just the sections in terms of the refugee law. And they're the ones that are on your permits. The email addresses that you need to send to are the email addresses set out and listed on the infographic that is linked above. There are two possibilities of what happens then in the next step, step 4 on the diagram. The one possibility is that you will receive via email an extension of your refugee or asylum document. It will come to your email address as an attachment that is password protected. In order to open up the document and save a copy of it on your phone or on your computer or to print it out, you will need to use your Home Affairs reference number, that ID number that I was speaking about before. So for example, the DBR COD 00785400822, or if it's a Messina one, MUS COD one, you use that number as your password in order to open up the document. If you do not receive an extension of your document, it is likely that you will get another email from the Department of Home Affairs requesting various things. It'll either be an email to say, please attend at the certain refugee reception office, you need to go and collect something, or alternatively, you maybe need to report to the Immigration Inspectorate. If you're required to report to immigration, that is often because your permit has expired before the 26th of February 2020. If your document expired before the 26th of February 2020, before the lockdown in South Africa and the pandemic, then the Department of Home Affairs is requiring most people in that situation to pay a fine at the court in order to renew their asylum or refugee document. If you have a very good reason for which your permit has expired, then you should also be given an opportunity to explain that to the court to avoid having to pay the fine. It is important to note that if you do pay the fine, then that's an admission of guilt. You are admitting that you are guilty of the criminal offense of failing to renew and keep your document up to date, and that is then goes against your record. Once you have either got the fine cancelled or you've paid the admission of guilt fine, then you take the proof of that to the Department of Home Affairs to renew your document. In some other areas, the processing is not the same as in Cape Town. So you might, for example, at the Port Elizabeth or Messina office, be given a notice to appear directly at the refugee reception office and pay the administrative fine there instead of going through the court process. I'm happy to advise further in terms of how you either apply for asylum or how you extend your asylum document. It's also important to note that if you have applied for an extension of your asylum document and you've been waiting for over a month or so, and then we do advise that you do maybe check your junk folder in your email address, but also send an email inquiring to the inquiries email address for the relevant refugee reception office. For example, at the Quebecer office, you would write to inquiries.quebecer@dha.gov.za. I beg your pardon, that's inquiries.quebecerrro@dha.gov.za. If it was the Cape Town office, for example, you would write to inquiries.ctrro@dha.gov.za. If it's for the Desmond Tutu Refugee Reception Office in Pretoria, it would be inquiries.dtrro@dha.gov.za. All the email addresses are set out in the infographic, which is available both in English and in French on our website. As I mentioned, when you're applying for an extension of your asylum or your refugee document, or once you received a decision from a refugee status determination officer and you're applying for your very first asylum document, you must send it to the relevant refugee reception office, which would be the office that you last extended or you obtained your refugee status determination office decision from. Under the subject line of the email, it's very important that you write your Home Affairs reference number. So it could, for example, be CTR COD 18430205. Then in your email, it's worthwhile and important to probably put the same information as you put in the form that you complete, that you're sending off. So you put your file number, your first name, your surname, your cell number, your alternative cell phone number, your email address, your current address, and send that off to Home Affairs along with the form that you've completed attached to your email, as well as your proof of residence and a copy of your last asylum or refugee document. If you don't have your asylum or refugee document, then as I mentioned, an affidavit also explaining that you've lost your document. It is very important that people try to and do make the applications themselves, and it's very important that anyone in this group assists people. As I mentioned in the previous voice note, it's very important for anybody to try to send off their email themselves and to be empowered on how to make an application for asylum, as well as how to extend and renew your asylum or refugee documentation. It's also valuable and good to make sure that you obtain your own personal email address, so you're not working through a third party or through an internet cafe or something like that, and that you use the same email address throughout the refugee process, because that's the email address that the Department of Home Affairs will continue to use. Among the infographics, we've also provided an infographic that explains a little bit about the detention and deportation process and how it works and how to avoid detention and deportation. We also have an infographic on access to healthcare. We have an infographic on how to join onto the file of a family member who's on asylum or refugee documentation. When you talk about joining onto the file of, or family unification, family joining, that is also done currently by means of an email, applying for an appointment, and then going to Home Affairs on the appointment in order to join, let's say, for example, your children onto your file. We also have and provide a infographic that sets out and explains how you apply for a refugee ID or how you apply for a refugee travel document or passport. The 13-digit ID books or ID cards, as well as travel documents, passports, are only available to recognized refugees once the Department of Home Affairs has decided that you fall within one of those three definitions I spoke to at the beginning and have granted you refugee status. If you have any questions about the asylum or refugee process, the definition of who is a refugee, in a few moments I'll open up the floor for questions. I also just wanted to speak to three other small points before I go into that. The one is that when you apply for asylum, you need to be somebody who falls within one of the three definitions. So somebody who fled persecution, somebody who fled a war-torn situation, or somebody who's dependent. And then in addition to which, you cannot be one of the excluded categories. So somebody who has been involved in very heinous or serious crimes, like war crimes, crimes against humanity, something like that, that would exclude you from refugee protection. Exclusions used to be very uncommon. The law on exclusions has changed, though, since 2020. And so because of that, there are also other categories. For example, if you didn't use an official port of entry coming into the country, or you delay in applying for asylum, or you're a fugitive from justice. We know, though, that in those kind of situations, it's likely that those cases first haven't been implemented, but even if they are implemented, there's something that there'd be a strong argument against the enforcement of them, because basically you should be able to apply for asylum and there shouldn't be a barrier to applying in terms of the exclusion provisions. once you have or are issued refugee status, you have that refugee status for as long as it would not be safe for you to return to your home country. If the situation in your home country have changed, and so that's what you call ceased circumstances, it's no longer unsafe to return for you as an individual or for a class of individuals, and then that's what we call cessation. You cease to be a refugee. In some cases where people apply as recognized refugees and they apply for permanent residence in South Africa to the Standing Committee, then the Standing Committee responds that it's no longer unsafe to return to your country, and therefore there are ceased circumstances, and you'll be required to explain why you think you're still a refugee, or otherwise you would get a final withdrawal of your refugee status and you'll be required to return to your country. The last point, and probably the most important point of all refugee law, of all the asylum and refugee process, is that it is illegal in terms of South African law, in terms of international law, to require anybody to return to a country where their life, liberty, fundamental human rights would be at risk because of a well-founded fear of persecution, or because of the external aggression, foreign occupation events seriously disturbing, disrupting to public order. So the generalized violence, war-torn situation. So for example, if you're from a part of the Eastern Congo where there is war going on, or you're from the part of a country that is generally safe, but you have a well-founded fear of persecution, you'll be targeted or attacked because of your perhaps political opinion or your religion, then as long as it's unsafe for you to return and your life, liberty, your freedom, your fundamental human rights will be at risk if you're returning, then you're protected from returning to your country or being prevented from entering a country. So this is called the principle of non-refoulement. The principle of non-refoulement says that you cannot be returned to a place where your life, liberty, fundamental human rights will be at risk because of your refugee claim. That's protected in terms of Section 2 of the Refugees Act, as well as protected in terms of international law, in terms of the refugee conventions. At this point, I'm going to open it up to the floor. I hope and trust that either Diana or Isaiah, you can open it up to the floor. And I am happy to take any questions that anybody might have about the asylum process, or in terms of how to apply for asylum, or any of the other content that I've discussed. Who is a refugee? Who falls within the definition of a refugee? Thank you. You're also welcome to pose the questions in the chat. If you don't leave a voice note, you can pose the questions in French or in English. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you very much, James, for your time, and thank you for all these explanations that you gave to us regarding the Refugees Act and all the details that it needed. I've got just one concern, James, especially for people who don't speak English, and when they come, the first interview that they do, they mostly need an interpreter, which in most of cases, the interpreters don't translate exactly what the asylum seekers have said. And then at the end, we have cases of appeal. We've got cases that are rejected. How can we sort out this matter so that the asylum seekers shouldn't become victims because of the interpreter that couldn't stand up to his task? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, for the questions. So you do have a right to have an interpreter. An interpreter must be provided to allow you to complete your forms when you apply for asylum. And you also have a right to interpretation services when you do your first interview at Home Affairs. Interpreters should not be the reason for which cases are rejected, but we know in some cases the interpretation is not what it should be and is not correct. It's important for somebody who arrives who doesn't speak English to request that they have an interpreter and that the process is followed correctly. If your case is rejected as unfounded or manifestly unfounded, you are given an opportunity to contest that, either to write representation to the Standing Committee or to appeal to the Refugee Appeal Board. Donc, vous avez le droit à prendre quelqu'un qui peut traduire votre cas à Home Affairs, et c'est très important à prendre quelqu'un qui peut faire ça. Si les translations n'est pas bon, puis vous avez la deuxième chance à expliquer votre cas à Home Affairs, à la Refugee Appeal Authority ou à le Standing Committee. Désolé que je ne peux pas parler très bien en français. Merci.